They tried to hide this meeting. The Kremlin covered it. State media buried it. But the footage got out. And what Vladimir Putin said in that room, in front of his own economists, is the most damaging thing he has ever said on camera. Not because of what he revealed, because of what he could not hide. Stay with me for the next few minutes because this story will completely change how you understand what is actually happening inside Russia right now. Let's start with the room itself, not the grand ceremonial hall with the marble floors and the gilded ceilings where Putin signs decrees for the cameras. Not the long table where he parks himself at one end while his generals sit at the other, too far away to challenge him, too intimidated to tell him anything real. A smaller room, a quieter room, the kind where historically the most important things happen and the least amount of truth is spoken. Putin called a meeting on economic issues. He sat down. He looked at the numbers his own government produced. And then he said something out loud that no amount of state media management could walk back. Quote, "Statistics show that economic growth has unfortunately been declining for 2 months in a row. Overall, GDP contracted by 1.8% between January and February." That sentence, from Vladimir Putin's own mouth, is the economic equivalent of a general calling from the front and saying the war is not going according to plan. And if that number surprises you, the real numbers behind it will stop you cold. Keep watching because the figures we are about to walk through are not Western estimates. They are Russia's own data, and they are catastrophic. If you find this kind of deep daily breakdown valuable, hit subscribe right now. We track these numbers every single day. GDP down 1.8% in just January and February 2026. Manufacturing falling, construction collapsing, business revenues declining across almost every sector, a federal budget deficit of $60 billion and growing, oil and gas revenues, the financial spine of the entire Russian state, down 45.4% compared to the same period last year. And Russia's central bank is holding interest rates so high that meaningful investment has essentially stopped. These are not the numbers of a country in a rough patch. These are the numbers of a country in a death spiral. And here is the piece that should alarm you most. In 2023 and 2024, Russia's GDP was growing at rates exceeding 4%. In 2024 specifically, it approached 5%. That growth was real, driven by wartime government spending, high oil prices, and sanctions-busting trade through China, India, and Turkey. Then 2025 came, and growth dropped from nearly 5% to 1%. A single year. And now the first 2 months of 2026 show a contraction of 1.8% against those already weak 2025 baseline numbers. The direction is not just down, it is accelerating downward. And here is where it starts getting genuinely revealing, because Russia's own institutions have started contradicting each other in ways that expose the panic underneath the surface. Russia's central bank forecast 1.6% GDP growth for the first quarter of 2026. Russia's Academy of Sciences says the first quarter will actually show a 1.5% year-on-year decline. Two government-adjacent Russian institutions. A gap of 3.1 percentage points between them. That gap does not exist because economists are uncertain. That gap exists because one institution is managing the political environment and the other is trying to describe reality. And the distance between those two things, between the managed narrative and the actual situation on the ground, is precisely as wide as those 3.1 points. When Putin's team was asked to explain why the economy contracted so sharply, they had an answer ready: the calendar. January 2026 had 2 fewer working days than January 2025. February had 1 fewer. 3 fewer working days total. That, they argued, explains a 1.8% GDP contraction. Let us apply that explanation to the real world. The United Kingdom recorded 0.1% real GDP growth in January and 0.5% in February. Japan, the United States, and the G7 as a whole recorded growth between 0.1% and 0.3% across the same period. These countries had the same calendar. They grew. Russia contracted by 1.8%. The calendar did not cause this. The war caused this. 4 years of a wartime economy, 4 years of capital flight, 4 years of Russia's most educated, most skilled citizens choosing to leave rather than stay. 4 years of rational businesses refusing to invest in an environment of complete uncertainty. That is what produced 1.8%, not the calendar. That is what happens when economic policy is made in a room where telling the leader the truth is more dangerous than telling him what he wants to hear. Stay with this because the industrial numbers are coming, and they are significantly worse than the headline GDP figure suggests. Putin did try to find a bright spot in the data. He pointed to Russia's official unemployment rate, 2.1%. And on the surface, that sounds extraordinary. The United States, most of Europe, most of the developed world would consider that number a landmark achievement. But here is what that number actually measures in Russia. Economist Valentin Katasanov has documented that it excludes anyone who is not formally registered as unemployed with government authorities. It excludes workers whose hours have been dramatically reduced. It excludes employees technically on the books but sitting idle at factories that do not have enough orders to keep them busy. When these groups are properly counted, Katasanov's assessment is that the real unemployment rate is approximately double the official figure. But here is the deeper problem with that 2.1% number. Even if you accept it completely at face value, it is not a success story. It is a labor crisis in disguise. Russia's own central bank governor, a Putin appointee, has publicly warned that Russian businesses are being forced to raise wages sharply to compete for workers in a labor market that simply does not have enough people. Higher wages are driving production costs up. Production costs rising are creating price shocks for consumers. The labor shortage has become the central bank's primary threat to price stability. And why is there a labor shortage? Ukraine claims Russia has suffered over 1.31 million casualties since the invasion began. Russia entered the war already facing severe demographic decline. The most optimistic scenarios for stabilizing Russia's population required 550,000 migrants per year just to offset natural decline. Then add the war dead. Then add the hundreds of thousands who voluntarily left. The engineers, the doctors, the technologists, the entrepreneurs who read what was coming and got out. A 2.1% unemployment rate in Russia is not evidence of a healthy economy. It is the labor market signal of a country that has lost an enormous share of its working age population. And that signal is getting louder every quarter. Now let us go inside the industrial numbers because the headline GDP figure is the summary. The details are measurably worse. Construction, one of the foundational pillars of Russia's domestic economy, output fell 16% year-on-year in January 2026, then fell a further 14% in February. That is not a slowdown, that is a collapse. Investment in fixed capital fell 5.3% in the fourth quarter of 2025. Nobody is building because nobody is committing new money to build anything. Manufacturing output fell 2.9% year-on-year in the first 2 months of 2026. Russia's cargo transport, the physical movement of goods across the country, dropped to its lowest level since the peak of the COVID-19 pandemic in 2020. Let that land for a moment. Russia's logistics system is currently moving less freight than it did during the worst global pandemic in living memory. Retail trade is stagnant. Annual wage growth that was running at 13.5% in 2025 has dropped to 8% in February 2026. And the companies operating inside all of this are responding the way companies only respond when they believe the situation is serious and sustained. Cartex, the mining excavator plant, 38% of its workforce on reduced hours. In the Leningrad region alone, 8 enterprises have stopped production entirely. Another 16 have cut their working schedules. Avtovaz, Russia's largest car manufacturer, production halted. KAMAZ, Russia's largest truck manufacturer, forced onto 4-day work weeks, a move it was first pushed into in the summer of 2025 as vehicle sales collapsed, and it is now repeating it. Uralvagonzavod, Russia's primary tank manufacturer, mass layoffs announced. Some units reduced by 50% of their workforce. The tank factory. Russia is fighting a war that consumes armored equipment at a rate the entire world can see, and the factory responsible for building the replacements is laying off half its workers. That is not a coincidence. That is a production system under a strain that has exceeded its capacity. Now follow the money, because the federal budget is where the full picture becomes impossible to ignore. Russia's oil and gas revenue, historically representing between 30 and 50% of all federal income, collapsed by 45.4% in the first quarter of 2026, compared to the same quarter in 2025. Lower global oil prices drove this. Western sanctions forced Russia's exports to sell at a discount. Ukrainian strikes on Russian oil infrastructure damaged both production and export capacity. The shadow fleet moving Russian oil operates at higher cost and dramatically lower efficiency than legitimate commercial shipping. Russia attempted to compensate by taxing everything else more aggressively. VAT increases, excise tax increases, heavier business taxes. The result was 7% more revenue from non-energy sources. 7% gained against a 45.4% loss. Total federal revenue for the first quarter of 2026 was 8.2% lower than the same period in 2025. And on the spending side, expenditures jumped 17%. The war does not reduce its consumption of money because the revenue side deteriorates. The resulting deficit for Q1 2026 alone, 4.58 trillion rubles, 60 billion US dollars. In a single quarter, Russia is spending $60 billion more than it is collecting, while simultaneously fighting a war, paying soldiers, maintaining the social programs that prevent open civil unrest, and servicing the debt accumulated from every previous deficit. Russia's national wealth fund, the reserve buffer built during the years of high oil prices, has been significantly depleted. Russia has now suspended gold and foreign currency transactions until July 1st. Suspended normal transactions to preserve what remains of its foreign currency reserves. That is not a sign of financial stability. That is a country watching its runway disappear and trying to stretch what little remains. There was a temporary reprieve that arrived from the most unexpected direction. When U.S. military operations against Iran triggered a blockade of the Strait of Hormuz, roughly 20% of the world's daily oil and LNG supply was disrupted. Prices spiked toward $100 per barrel. Even at a discount, Russia's shadow fleet was suddenly selling oil for significantly more than before. Reuters reported in April that Russia's main oil tax revenue would reach approximately $9 billion for that month alone, double the baseline figure. That sounds, at first glance, like a genuine rescue. Russia's own think tank, CASF, has modeled what it actually means. Even with elevated prices, even with the Hormuz disruption continuing, their optimistic scenario has Russian economic growth not exceeding 1.3% for the full year of 2026. Their realistic scenario is recession. CASF's own analysts described the oil price boost in terms that should be quoted directly: a band-aid on a gaping wound. That phrase did not come from Western analysis or from Ukrainian officials. That came from Russian economists describing their own country's situation to their own government. The wound is real. The band-aid is temporary. And the wound underneath is getting larger. Here's the mechanism that separates what Russia is experiencing from a normal economic downturn. Economies recover from contractions through investment. Companies and governments commit capital to new capacity, new technology, new infrastructure. Investment generates employment. Employment generates consumer spending. Spending generates demand. Demand generates further investment. The investment cycle is the engine that restarts a struggling economy. Russia's investment cycle is broken at its foundation. Business investment into Russian companies declined 2.3% in 2025. Russia's own Ministry of Economic Development anticipates another decline in 2026. And the specific detail that explains why the cycle cannot restart, the only investments currently flowing into Russian businesses are coming from those businesses themselves, from whatever retained earnings remain after operating costs. There is no foreign capital. There is no domestic entrepreneurial investment. Foreign investors face sanctions. Russian entrepreneurs have spent years watching the state seize private assets, destroy businesses, and imprison executives. The institutional trust that a functioning investment environment requires was systematically destroyed long before February 2022. It is not available to be switched back on. And the businesses that remain are now generating fewer profits, which means they invest less in themselves, which means they become less competitive, which means they generate even fewer profits. That loop has been running for 4 years. The cumulative damage is visible in every data set we have reviewed. There is no external force positioned to break it. 2 Russian economists, Vasily Burov, director of the Estanto Lab consulting firm, and Andrei Yakovlev, associate researcher at Harvard University's Davis Center, published an analysis that clarifies the historical scope of what is happening. Their central argument: Putin's economic system was broken before the invasion began. The war did not create Russia's structural problems. It accelerated them and made them impossible to conceal. Putin spent years concentrating Russia's wealth and resources among regional elites, Kremlin-connected businesses, and state-favored oligarchs. That concentration produced chronic underinvestment in social services, infrastructure, and the productive capacity that generates broad economic well-being. Burov and Yakovlev described the consequence of this with uncomfortable precision. It created a domestic economic underclass, men with no economic future, who sign military contracts because the military salary exceeds anything available to them at home. The system concentrated wealth at the top, left the regions economically hollowed out, and then used the desperation of those regions to staff the military. And here is the conclusion those economists reach that transforms this from a wartime story into a generational story. Even if the war in Ukraine ended tomorrow, even if a ceasefire was signed tonight, sanctions were lifted, and Russia was welcomed back into global trade by next month, the structural damage remains. The institutional trust is gone. The human capital that emigrated has built new lives in other countries. They are not returning. The demographic damage from war casualties will not reverse for a generation. The cronies who profit from the current system have every rational incentive to prevent it from changing. Ending the war removes the excuse for the crisis. It does not remove the crisis. The political dimension of this matters as much as the economic one. Putin called the meeting on economic issues publicly. He demanded explanations from his economists on the record. The economists in that room faced a choice that has no good answer inside an authoritarian system. Tell Putin the truth, that his war is destroying Russia's economic foundations, and the only path to stabilization requires ending that war, and accept the consequences that historically come with delivering unwelcome information to leaders of this type. Or tell Putin what he wants to hear, that the problems are temporary, calendar-related, externally caused, and watch as every policy response fails, because it is responding to a false diagnosis of the actual disease. Economic policy inside Russia right now is being made in a room where honesty is structurally dangerous. No level of competence can overcome that constraint. Meanwhile, Russia's central bank governor is making public statements about wage-driven inflation and labor shortages, not because she wants to create alarm, because the problems have grown large enough that silence has become more dangerous to manage than disclosure. When a central bank governor appointed by Putin starts warning publicly, the problems have surpassed the regime's capacity to absorb them quietly. And the political logic of all of this feeds directly into the foundation of Putin's power. His internal legitimacy, the calculation by security services, regional governors, and oligarchs that stability under Putin is preferable to the uncertainty of whatever follows him, that calculation depends on a visible appearance of competence and forward momentum. That appearance is deteriorating publicly. The meeting where Putin demanded reports from his own economists was itself a public admission of visible deterioration. A leader whose political identity is built entirely on projecting strength and control just acknowledged on the record that his own targets are being missed. The analysts studying the full picture, the demographic collapse, the capital flight, the institutional destruction, the lost generation of educated professionals, the physical damage to productive capacity, are arriving at an assessment that sounds extreme until you trace through the actual arithmetic. Russia, under current trajectories, faces a recovery timeline measured not in years, but in decades. The demographic loss from war casualties requires a generation to partially address. The human capital exodus, the engineers, the physicians, the technologists, the entrepreneurs who built new lives elsewhere, that loss compounds annually. Rebuilding the legal, regulatory, and financial institutional environment that attracts serious investment takes decades under the best conditions. Russia's was already degraded before 2022. It has been actively dismantled since. The infrastructure of economic governance, independent courts, enforceable property rights, reliable contract law, systematically replaced by a system where all outcomes depend on proximity to one man. When that man is gone, and he will eventually be gone, there is no institutional framework remaining to organize a recovery around. There is only the vacuum left by 4 decades of deliberate dismantling of every institution not directly useful to Vladimir Putin. Filling that vacuum requires building a functioning state largely from the beginning, in a country with a shrinking population, a depleted sovereign wealth fund, an economy in recession, and 4 decades of accumulated international distrust to overcome. Russia is heading into recession in 2026. Not possibly heading. The Russian Academy of Sciences says it. The granular sector data says it. Even the central bank's own managed numbers, read without the spin applied to them, say it. The war continues, consuming an estimated $300 million per day or more. The budget deficit compounds every quarter. The oil revenue, temporarily elevated by the Hormuz disruption, will normalize when that crisis resolves. The investment cycle has no mechanism to restart inside the current system. The labor shortage worsens as the war continues, removing working-age men from the civilian economy. The factories cutting hours and halting production are not making temporary adjustments. They are responding to a permanent condition. The orders are not there, and the capital is not there. Uralvagonzavod, the tank factory cutting 50% of its workforce, will not reverse those layoffs until demand returns. And demand comes from a military budget already running a $60 billion quarterly deficit with no credible path to improvement. The only mechanism for genuine economic recovery inside Russia would require changing the system itself, the concentration of wealth, the military spending, the war. Nobody inside Putin's orbit has both the will and the institutional position to demand that change. Putin's most likely response, based on the evidence of the meeting, is to demand better numbers from his economists, while leaving unchanged every policy producing the bad numbers. And so the spiral continues, quarter by quarter, sector by sector, factory by factory. GDP down 1.8%, a tank factory cutting half its workforce during a tank war, oil revenue down 45%, a $60 billion quarterly deficit, 8 enterprises in the Leningrad region that have stopped production entirely, a 2.1% unemployment rate that actually describes a labor crisis, over 1.3 million casualties hollowing out the workforce, mass emigration removing the human capital the economy would need to recover. Russian economists, not Western commentators, Russian economists, now writing openly that the system was broken before 2022, that the invasion accelerated it, and that ending the war does not repair the structural rot accumulated across decades. The gap between what the Kremlin is saying and what the data is showing is widening every quarter. Putin admitted it publicly by demanding explanations from the room. He blamed the calendar. The actual answer is sitting directly across from him every time he looks in a mirror. And in the back rooms of the Kremlin, among the people whose wealth and survival depend on this system continuing to function, a question is now being asked that was not being asked 2 years ago. Not out loud, not in any meeting with cameras present, but in the kind of room where the real conversations happen. What comes after this? We track these developments every single day. The numbers, the statements, the cracks forming inside systems that were designed never to crack. If today's breakdown gave you something the mainstream coverage is missing, drop what you think comes next in the comments below. The most interesting answers always come from this audience. And if you are not subscribed yet, now is the right time. This story is not finished, and neither are we.